Hey leader, and welcome to another episode of the L3 Leadership Podcast, where we are obsessed with helping you grow to your maximum potential and to maximize the impact of your leadership. My name is Doug Smith, and I am your host, and today's episode is brought to you by my friends at Baritone Advisors. We also recorded this episode live from the new Return.com studio. If you're new to the podcast, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here, and I hope that you'll enjoy our content and become a subscriber. Know that you can also watch all of our episodes over on our YouTube channel, so make sure you're subscribed there as well. And as always, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while and it's impacted your life, it would mean the world to me if you would leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. That really does help us to grow our audience and reach more leaders, so thank you in advance for that. Well, leader, in today's episode, you'll hear my conversation with Dr. Asa Lee, who is the president of the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And in our conversation, you'll hear Dr. Lee talk about how building Lego sets can impact your leadership. You'll hear him talk about the lessons that he's learned from the seminary's most famous alumni, Mr. Rogers, why presence and leadership matters, and so much more. But before we dive into the conversation, just a few announcements. This episode of the L3 Leadership Podcast is sponsored by Baritone Advisors. The financial advisors at Baritone Advisors help educate and empower clients to make informed financial decisions. You can find out how Baritone Advisors can help you develop a customized financial plan for your financial future by visiting their website at baritoneadvisors.com. That's BERATUNG advisors.com. Securities and investment products and services offered through LPL Financial, member FINRA and SIPC. Baritone Advisors, LPL Financial, and L3 Leadership are separate entities. I also want to thank our sponsor, Henny Jewelers. They're a jeweler owned by my friend and mentor, John Henny. And my wife, Laura, and I got our engagement and wedding rings through Henny Jewelers and had an incredible experience. And not only do they have great jewelry, but they also invest in people. In fact, for every couple that comes in engaged, they give them a book to help them prepare for marriage. And we just love that. So if you're in need of a good jeweler, check out hennyjewelers.com. And I also want to thank our new sponsor, Return.com. And leader, let me just ask you this. Have you ever had an interest in investing in real estate? Well, now for as little as $500, you can become a commercial real estate investor. Just visit Return.com to learn more. That's REITURN.com. Investing involves risk. Please consult the Return Offering Circular if you're interested in investing. And with all that being said, let's dive right in. Here's my conversation with Dr. Asa Lee. Well, Dr. Asa Lee, it is an honor and a privilege to have you on the podcast. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. People won't have context for this, but we were just joking. This has been the most rescheduled podcast in L3 leadership history. So I just really appreciate your graciousness with my reschedules. But for those who may not be familiar with you, can you just kind of give us an overview of who you are and what you do?
Certainly. Thanks, Doug. Asa Lee. I'm the president of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. It's hard to describe what a seminary president does, but in essence, I'm the equivalent of a university president or a high school principal, or in some cases, some days, a church pastor, all in one.
Well, I certainly want to dive into all those things, but give us a little bit of context of your leadership background and what got you to where you are today.
Yeah, so I am originally from the Washington, D.C. area and served first stint in public school education, and then went from public school education into ministry and served in ministry for a number of years, and then, into the academy, into the classroom, and then sojourned into higher ed administration, first as a dean, then as a sort of vice president of operations and administration. And then in 2021 came up here to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and took the presidency here. So it's been a very interesting journey of first sort of an educator, then a pastoral leader, then a pastoral educator, and then a higher ed administrator. And then, here we are.
Yeah, and I'm always curious, I'm sure calling had a part to play in this, but I'm always curious why people choose the fields that they do. And so can you just tell us, why did you choose to go the higher ed route, the ministry route, and why do you think that can make the greatest impact from your life?
Yeah, so I tell people I didn't choose ministry. Ministry chose me. I first heard the call to ministry when I was 13 years old. Wow. And it was an audible call in the sense that I was in junior high and kind of turned around when I heard the voice of what I now understand is the Spirit of God to say, you're going to pastor my people. And I kind of turned around to see what that was about. I grew up in church, so I knew what that meant. So that meant I spent the next 10 years running from that very thing. You know, it was very clear. I don't want to be a part of that. That's not what I want to do. Pastors stand up every Sunday and they get a lot of flack. And that's what I want to do. I did want to be an educator. I did enjoy sort of one of the most pivotal, one very pivotal moment for me was being asked to explain a lesson in a class, in a music class. And I remember vividly, and still to this day, this is the thing that always gets me excited, is the look on people's faces when they get it. Right? It's a contact high. It's just an incredible experience to see people, whether it's Bible study, life lessons, sitting in a meeting, when people start nodding their heads and they start getting it, or you give them a concept that they've never received before. I remember as a kid having that experience. And ever since then, I was like, I want to be part of that journey for folks. So I always wanted to be an educator, didn't ever want to be a pastor. And so I went to school to be a music educator. I was a musician and studied to be a music teacher and was a music teacher for a short period of time. And really enjoyed that. But when I was about 24 and graduated from 23, graduated from college and gotten a job and was working in a church and teaching. And that voice came back from the age of 13 and said, "You've played enough. It's time." And I have to say, it was time. It was time for that. And so both worlds kind of had merged, right? So I fall in love with the pastoral ministry and the idea of leading people to a better vocational sense of who they are in God and being able to give themselves to God for the work of ministry. But then also, like, you still get to educate folks and you still get to see that bright light happen in their eyes. And so the last 10 or plus years in theological education means I've been able to live both of these things together in a very exciting way. So I enjoy what I do.
Wow. One thing I want to take a side trail on is you talked about hearing the voice of God when I think you said you were 13 years old. You know, this is a leadership podcast. We have people of faith, people not of faith, but I think a lot of times it's interesting. I say similar things, like I felt like God dealt with my heart. And so many times I have leaders come up to me and say, like, how do you actually know God spoke to you? And I'm just curious, in the way you describe it to people, if someone's trying to discern or hear God's voice, what would your advice be to them? Seeking out God's will for their life?
Well, I think one of the most important things is, and we miss this sometimes in the American expression of Christianity, especially in the American church, is that we often sometimes think we're supposed to go at it alone. But living a life of faith is not a lonely proposition. It's actually a communal proposition. The biblical record is countless examples of people working in community. Right? Even Jesus calls a community together to carry out God's mission. So I think part of what we have to recognize is God puts people in our lives that helps to surround us with sort of acts of confirmation, challenge, hope, encouragement, a reprimand. All of that is important. So you may hear something, or you may discern something, or you may sense something, but then also there's the moment where somebody else comes to you and says, "You are what." They give you a statement or something like that. In my case, people have been calling me Reverend Lee since I was a kid because I talk with my hands a lot. You'll see that, right? So, there are pictures of me as a kid. Like, I have this vivid picture of me on one of those play telephones at like 3 years old, and I'm doing this. That's awesome. And I look like a preacher, right? So they called me Reverend Lee. Well, when I was ordained, my mother told the story to the church about how a great aunt christened that and saw that in me at a very young age, right? So community matters. It was once I announced the call, the acceptance of my call on my life, the church that I was serving at the time as a minister of music, one woman in the choir said, when I said, I'm called to preach, and I was crying, all kind of stuff, and she looked at me and said, "Oh, we've known that for years." Right. So community helps to affirm sort of where you're going on this. So you don't have to do this alone, is my point.
Yeah, I guess on that note, I guess I would be curious because community is one of our core values at L3 Leadership. We believe no leader should ever do life alone, but in community for all the reasons that you just mentioned. But yet, statistically, I saw a stat I think Henry Cloud shared that he believes about 80% of leaders, when asked, said they don't have one person that they can
Mm,
confide in their leadership journey. And you've obviously grown into a significant leadership role, get to interact with a lot of pastors. And I know that could be a lonely world. I'm just curious, at your level, how do you seek out intentional community that can continue to sharpen you and not, I know a lot of times leaders actually, the higher they go up, the more they're paranoid, they're afraid people take advantage of
mhm.
them or not. I'm just curious, how do you intentionally pursue community in this season of your life?
It's funny because I'm often quoted to say I don't want any new friends. um, but I keep running into people who are of like mind, and we're drawn. Like is drawn into like in that regard. And so I don't necessarily seek out because I do have a core group of friends who are positioned in places of their own leadership, and we can come together and talk about and pray for each other and do all the things that kind of edify each other without sort of the competition or the fear of what have you. And so I don't seek out folks. However, the way this job works is that you run into people who are of like mind, and in so doing, what are some of the attributes? Are they courageous? Do they speak their minds? Are they willing to be held accountable? Are they willing to hold me accountable? Are they not intimidated by, you know, stature or money or all these things? Are they true, genuine people? Are they people of integrity? And when you start adding all those filters, I got a core group of people. That's why I say no new friends. It's rare that people make it through all of those things, but
Wow.
when they
Yeah.
do, then you're able to share yourself in ways that the job is lonely, right? The
Yeah.
leadership in your context is always lonely, but being able to rely on others in your personal life and even in your professional life means that you have places that kind of sharpen the iron that you bring to the table. So yeah, those are kind of my attributes that I look for. People I can share myself with and are willing to share themselves with me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I think that the filtering process is good. I never really thought of it through that lens, but I guess I kind of naturally do that. But putting verbiage to it, that's
Mm.
significant. So you talked about you start off really as a teacher, but then you started growing in leadership and started having leadership roles, which requires a lot of growth. People don't understand. They see people sitting in your seat and think, "Oh, you just magically got there." I'm
Hmm.
always
Hmm.
anxious to ask leaders, what are some of the prices that you've had to pay, or maybe things that you've had to grow through in order to lead at the level you're leading today?
That's a really great question. There's always the price that we pay for balancing our families, right? In order to you make sacrifices with your family, and I'm grateful for my wife, who is also a pastor, but we have four daughters, and that means that there are a lot of four daughters of still school age, and so
Wow.
that means that there are a lot of different dynamics going on. But I'm grateful to her that she supports the journey I've been on, but that means I'm not at every soccer game. That means I'm not in spaces and places that helps all the time. I do the best I can, but I'm grateful for that kind of sacrifice. The other is that I haven't been able to chart a kind of trajectory that some other of my friends have been able to. I mean, I spent much of my 20s serving churches, and so I was a pastor, and pastors don't get to do things that a lot of other people get to do in their 20s. Uh, and so, I have no regrets about that. It's just an acknowledgement that, I've taken a different path, and that means how I relate to others can be lonely or different. And in many respects, I present a lot older and more mature than I am for people because I've had to grow up quickly. I started working in churches when I was 16 years old. So
Wow.
that meant I needed to comport myself with the level of maturity to be able to achieve things. Those are prices that I knew I had to pay, which is why in part I ran for so long.
Yeah.
Right? These are kind of the things that I knew I was going to get challenged by. So I wouldn't change anything about that, but it's just an acknowledgement that those are some of the key prices I had to pay.
Yeah. Well, 4 girls, school age. I have 4 kids, 2 boys, 2 girls. I got to ask, I love asking leaders, what are you learning in this season of parenting to be a good parent?
The beauty of children, young children, is that they always give you perspective,
Mm.
right? No matter how difficult your day has been, if the most important thing is my bologna sandwich fell on the floor at lunch and it ruined my day, it puts every other issue in perspective, right? And so being able to always come home to people whose worlds are not your world,
Mm.
and they're not intentionally selfish about it. It's just children are naturally self-centered because that's who they are. Um, that means you're always drawn into their world, and that's actually refreshing for me when I have to deal with, complex issues of budgeting or who are we going to hire or what is this going to be. Right? It's really quite simple. Make a better sandwich, right? Or or do the thing, Daddy, that you fill out the permission slip. Those are the things that matter. So I'm grateful for the humility that children bring in our lives, especially in this season where I think all of us as parents of young children post COVID are all kind of figuring out the shifting sands of what it means to be a parent in this day and age.
So are you still mastering the art of making a sandwich, or have you got that down?
I'm an excellent sandwich maker.
Make a better sandwich. That's so funny. I mean, I could just hear my kids. Come on,
Yep.
Daddy.
Yep.
I do.
Yep.
I want to talk a little bit about leadership and researching this. I've read articles and listened to a few other things that you were on. And one thing you said, presence and availability are hallmarks of your leadership style. I think that's beautiful, but I would love to hear you talk more about that.
Yeah. When you're a chief executive, the corner office is often the most distant office in the organization, right? So you got to go through layers and gatekeepers to get there. And so to the extent possible, and this takes courage of the leader, which I can talk about later, but in this day and age, a lot of our institutions are going through transitions and changes. And so being a present and available leader means coming out of the office and not sort of walking the halls, stalking people, but, what does it mean to kind of sit in the courtyard of our campus, for example? And that's where I respond to emails. Or I'm taking lunch when I'm available in the cafeteria next to students, right? What does it mean to keep the door open so that anybody that just drops in has an opportunity to have 5 minutes with the president? What difference can that do in your organization in terms of the ability of transparency and organizational management? Certainly, there are things that you can't talk about because of propriety or what have you, but there are a lot of things you can talk about. And so learning to be able to balance sort of being present when you need to be, but also being available. This is an important value that I learned as a pastor. It costs nothing for you to spend 5 minutes shaking some hands and being at the beginning of an event or being at the end of an event and seeing folks. How many emails can you avoid by spending 5 minutes saying hello to folks?
Wow.
And that just saves a lot of time and a lot of energy, but it also gives you a constant check-in to say, the energy in this meeting doesn't feel right. And this wasn't my meeting, but I know what to ask when I have my cabinet meeting later on, right? Is everything okay in the institution? Is everything all right with that? What's happening over here? So temperature checking is a key part of that presence. Because if you're present, then you're also making yourself available in some way.
I love that. We were just talking, before we jumped on the call, you're getting ready for your fall board meeting. You talked about the budget, all the fun stuff involved with leadership that people want to do when they're in their 20s. A lot of pressure comes with leadership. I'm just curious, how do you personally deal with the pain and pressure and stress that comes with your job?
So I have various different outlets. What I'm known for is in my office here, you can't see anything at the moment, but my office here, I have Lego bricks and Lego sets everywhere.
Huh.
So, over here on my bookshelf is a Sydney Opera House and a Tower Bridge. And over here is a 4-foot model of a Titanic. That was my summer project last year. I mean, I have That's, Legos are an important leadership kind of thing. They always remind me, always remind me, I grew up at a time when Legos were, you bought a box of Legos and they were all just a bunch of Legos. They didn't have any instructions. You built what was over on the box. You just kind of threw them together, you built what on the box. Nowadays they've got complex, builds and all that other good stuff. But what I learned early on is, the bricks, you can only build with the bricks that you have. You can't, if you need a circle and you have squares, you're not going to get to a circle. You got to figure out, how do you build with the bricks that you have? So, one of my outlets is if I'm working on a big project or I got some big thing going on, building a Lego build is very tactile, practical. I've accomplished something for the day, right? So I got an outlet like that. Another outlet is I garden. I do a lot of gardening, vegetable gardens, and tomatoes, squash, cabbage, potatoes, all sorts of things. Working in the soil, again, very tactile, being able to do this. I spend a lot of time working on tactile kinds of things, which you can do a thing in a short period of time, and you can walk away from that thing and say, I accomplished something. And so those are things that keep me sort of de-stressed in that way. Because if I can do those things, then I feel like I'm accomplished. But I'm also, while you're doing those things, working on those complex issues that you've got to deal with on a regular basis. So I have several outlets like that.
Yeah, I love that. I remember in 2008, I went to a conference, heard Rick Warren say, he told leaders you need to divert daily, withdraw weekly, and abandon annually. But the divert daily, which you're living this out, he basically just said, if you work with your mind all day, you need to do something with your hands. And he actually mentioned gardening, but I love the Lego thing. Do you have, a random question, do you have any bucket list Lego builds that you're like, hey, I know what I'm doing next year and the year after, like what's next?
So one of my bucket lists was the Titanic. So I did that.
Check.
And so that was like a big deal, and I was just giddy when it was done. The other is the Concorde that just came out. There's a set that is the Air France Concorde or British Airways Concorde. So that's probably gonna be next summer. I made it a habit. I've been in theological education in one form or another for almost 18 years now. And so when I started teaching about 10 years ago, I every year at the end of the academic year, I would either be gifted or I would go and buy a Lego set. So, the Eiffel Tower or the Concorde is going to be next year's. It's a 5-foot tall, 4.5 foot tall Eiffel Tower thing. Wow. So I have no places to put these things. That's the problem.
I was going to ask, does your wife let you bring these home?
No.
Yeah.
That's why they're in my office in my conference room upstairs. I can't have them at home.
That's wonderful. Yeah. You mentioned that these are outlets for dealing with stress. And I also love asking leaders just what they do to incorporate rest or Sabbath into their life. Just because, especially nowadays with all the mental health issues going down, I mean, leaders just go so hard for so long without taking a breaks. Do you have any rhythms of rest or Sabbath in your life?
So one is, and I, like most leaders, and when it comes to rest, I'm not good at it. But I try to I'll press hard for every, 4 to 6 weeks, kind of push through with some stuff, and then try to use a week on week 7 to power down in some way or another, whether that is, some golf or, just not in the office or double down with family time, that kind of stuff. Again, that rhythm is difficult depending on when that 7th week falls, but I try to be able to do that. For example, we're in the midst of the push leading up to the board meeting, but week 7 comes after the board meeting is done, and I'll be in San Antonio for a little bit, and I'll be in Atlanta, and then Thanksgiving and that kind of stuff. So that's one important aspect of that. The other is it takes me about 10 days to really power down. Right. So this idea that I can take a week vacation and I'm good, no. If I'm going to really power, I need 2 weeks back to back. That whole first week, it takes about 4 days just to learn to deprogram grabbing my phone every 5 minutes to check emails. Right. And then about week 1 is done, I'm now in the position where I can actually rest. And then week 2 is beneficial. So, taking 2 weeks at a time as opposed to 1 week is an important learning that I developed over the years when you really want to power down altogether.
Yeah, my wife and I started implementing that a few years ago. And yeah, I absolutely agree with you. That week to get unwound and then actually be able to rest is huge. Another one of your responsibilities as a leader is culture building. You're responsible for the culture of your organization. I'll just leave it open-ended. What have you learned about building great cultures?
Cultures are maintained, built, and sustained by people. So choosing the right people, one bit of advice that was most important for me as a leader coming up was choosing. The most important thing you'll do as a leader is choosing who's going to be on your team. And that's important because who you choose on your team helps to build the culture you want to have, right? And so conversely, cultures are maintained, toxic cultures and other cultures are maintained by people as well. The challenge often, though, is if you inherit an old culture, like in the case of Pittsburgh Seminary, which is 230 years old,
Wow.
Cultures are often maintained by people. Some cultures are created by people who are gone.
Wow.
And therefore people maintain a culture that no one is invested in anymore. That's where you get statements like, we've always done it that way, but nobody knows why we do it that way. And nobody knows who's servicing who to continue to do it that way. And so you sometimes have to fight ghosts, I like to say. You have to spend time sort of speaking to the zombies that are walking around that nobody knows what's going on, but this system was put in place by somebody who's been dead for 30 years. Wow. But yet we still do this thing. Does it work? No. Well, then having the right people present means you can begin to change the culture more rapidly because they're willing to do something else. That's hard work because minding a culture means really getting into the minds of people and understanding why people do what they do there. Culture is not sort of this amorphous thing that just kind of happens. It's maintained by people, and people get something from the culture. So you've got to be able to navigate that as well.
Did you have that experience where you inherited an old culture and had to change? Was that difficult for you, and how did you change if you did?
Yeah, so Pittsburgh Seminary is a Presbyterian seminary. I am not Presbyterian. I am also the first African American and the youngest president in the school's history. Wow. So I check a lot of new boxes here. But what that really means is I'm not invested in the things that others that have held this office have been because of their denominational connection, because of their longevity in certain spaces. So I get to come in and ask good questions. That's the advantage of being new in so many different ways. Okay, so tell me what this is again. And that kind of gentle interrogation means things are changing and things are invited to be questioned. And what you actually discover is if you give, as president, the space for questioning, then other people ask the good questions. And then next thing you know, everybody's like, well, let's try something different. And so this has been the journey we've been on at Pittsburgh for the last 3 years, is questioning in not necessarily a bad way, but just simply interrogating everything to say, does this work for us now? It worked for us then. Does it work for us now? It doesn't. Oh, well, let's do something different. And in many cases, it's been the ghosts of our past that we've been running into to say, well, it was done by this person who was no longer here. Okay, great. Can we really do something different? And can we imagine something different?
Yeah. Have you found that in those instances where change is necessary, how often do the people have to change versus, by meaning bringing new people in who adopt a new culture because other people just can't make that transition to the new culture, versus being able to come in, get people to make that change? I'm just curious, what's your experience been?
So, this is probably, some people would call this a weakness or a bias. I'm an educator at heart. So my default is always that people will learn and change if they're teachable, right? Yeah. And, I got to say, we've not had nearly as much turnover as I thought we would in positions. Wow, the challenge is you've got to be patient. You got to be willing and frankly, sometimes you can't be patient. Sometimes the change needs to happen right away. But I've been afforded the luxury of being able to invite people to a different reality. And inviting people to a different reality, I'm inviting them to think differently. And inviting people to think differently, you then have to say, okay, I'm inviting you to think differently, and this is going to ask something different of you. And then here's a quick big piece: trust me, right? And so, there's a lot of asks in there, but in most cases, the community here has trusted me. When I first arrived here, the seminary was closed because it was in the middle of COVID. And so there was no real activity going on at all, but we had promised. I arrived in June of 2021, but we promised by August of 2021, the seminary would be open and the campus would be available. But when I arrived, there were no opening plans. There was no way to do any sort of, pre-screening or all the things that we got accustomed to back then. So I had done that work at my previous place. And so I had to say to them pretty quickly, you got to trust me and you got to think differently about this. And there were a lot of skeptics, but then we opened and we haven't had, any sort of mass breakouts of any kind. And so, okay, maybe this guy might be trustworthy here, right? But that's not to say that there hasn't been sort of the need to change some personnel, and that has had to happen as well. And that's partly because, as I tell people, I invite people to change. I invite people to journey with change. And sometimes they have to change outside of the institution. They can't do it here. And if that's okay, we've got to learn to do that as well.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about seminary. Obviously, you're passionate about it. You lead one, and you're responsible for really training and equipping people for ministry. Why are seminaries important? For those listening, why should they consider attending a seminary if they want to go into ministry?
Yeah, seminaries are some of the world's first vocational schools, right? In modern parlance, dating back to the late 18th, early 19th century. I call them pastor factories. They were designed to be places where people who were interested in being pastors would come, get trained, and go serve congregations. Pittsburgh Seminary is no different. It just was founded, when Western Pennsylvania was frontier country. And this seminary was founded in order to educate people for churches on the frontier. However, in the last 25, 30 years, with the decline of a lot of church attendance across, denominational life, in many places, people going to non-denominational churches in different communities, mainline traditional seminaries have been forced to change. And they've become less pastor factories and more vocational centers. And what I mean by that is, if you're a person of faith and you want to use your faith as a way of enacting change in the world, but you don't necessarily think you're called to be a pastor. You're not a pastor, but you may be a nonprofit person. You want to be a community organizer who uses faith to be able to do that. Seminaries are now retooling to be the places where you can learn Bible, you can learn communication, you can learn contextual analysis, and urban ministry and all sorts of other kinds of creative ways of doing ministry, and then go with certifications to go out and do that work. And so Pittsburgh Seminary is one of these places where that kind of activity is happening. If you want to be a mission person, if you want to be an urban ministry person, if you want to be someone that is doing creative work around youth and young adult ministry, this place is an example of that, where you're doing kind of credentialing in this way. So ministry is not anymore simply church pastoral ministry. It is now sort of a broadening of that scope that provides a deepening and equipping to strengthen people's call on their lives, whatever they feel themselves to be.
Yeah, and I'm curious, I'm always looking for how leaders think about developing and equipping leaders. In your experience, even through seminaries, et cetera, what have you found to be the best way to actually train people, disciple people, to actually go out and do great things with their lives to make an impact?
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great question, because this is kind of what my doctoral work was in, and that is, it first requires, when you're training folks, you got to do it in good communities. And diverse communities. And what I mean by diverse is not sort of just surface level diversity in terms of skin color or gender, but I mean sort of in experience, right? So even in the group that may be all male or all female, the lived experiences. You may have somebody that's married, somebody that's divorced, somebody that's single. You may have somebody who has a kid, nobody, right? All of those diversities matter because those life experiences, when you're trying to create a classroom environment or try to create a learning environment, that kind of those gentle differences become places where you're forced to identify who you are in relationship to somebody else. That does matter in the training. Second is being able to play and fail without consequence. This is a huge thing, and especially when I do leadership training. I talk about our fear of failure, right? And there's the old story of WD-40. Like, why do you know why is WD-40 WD-40? Well, because the previous 39 formulas didn't work, and so it was 39 failures. And this is true. You go look it up. The 39 failures. The 40th one worked. What do we call it? WD-40. And so that's the formula. Being able to create safe spaces where people can try out things and fail and then reflect on their failures is a really important place. So whether that is preaching or sharing the gospel or relationship building for fundraising purposes, right? Getting over those first sort of jitters and creating a space of play, if you will, means I can learn from my mistakes, and then I feel a little bit more confident when I'm going in that space. And then lastly, real world experience. So moving from sort of the safe place to actually getting out there and doing something and processing it. As a faculty member at my previous institution in Washington, D.C., my classroom was on K Street. We had a classroom space on K Street downtown in Washington, D.C. And, not many people outside of D.C. know this, but for a long time, and even still the case, K Street by day is known as the lobbying center of D.C., but by night, it is one of the, sex trafficking places in Washington, D.C. Wow. And so my students, as a part of their assignments on Sunday mornings, there was a church nearby, and they were required to volunteer. One of their options was to volunteer at that church early on Sunday morning. Like 6 a.m. And what they would discover is that that church had a recovery ministry, and they would be volunteering in that space, helping to give food and intervention work and all that kind of. And these were kids who were not all from cities. Some of these kids were like rural Iowa or Oklahoma. And so seeing a sex worker in need with a social worker and a caseworker, and you there with a blanket and a cup of coffee, kind of doing wraparound intervention work means, whoa, this is not book learning we're just talking about. We're also talking about real lives being impacted, and then coming back in the classroom and reflecting on that. Those are important parts of the kind of shaping for future leaders that that seminaries haven't done historically, but absolutely this world needs leaders to be able to do.
Yeah. A little bit of a shift. You have a somewhat famous graduate of the seminary, Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers for those listening.
Maybe people know them, right? Yep.
Yes, and he certainly didn't invent the word neighbor, but he did make it pretty popular in our culture. And obviously, Jesus talked a lot about loving your neighbor. I'll just leave this really open-ended, and certainly share any lessons that you learned from Fred. But what do you think about the theology of neighbor, and how should we think about that in loving our neighbor?
Yeah, so we've been on this journey here at the seminary to kind of enact in a pedagogical and a methodological way some of the lessons that Mr. Rogers taught all of us. He's a 1961 graduate of the seminary, and a lot of people know that Fred was a minister. They knew that he may have been an ordained minister, but they didn't know he actually went to seminary. And in talking to people in his world who worked with Fred, they say his seminary education really refined and honed his idea of the show. Wow. And so some of the takeaways for us is, Fred was teaching gospel lessons without ever using gospel or Jesus, right? He embodied and was the real deal of what it means to be a community, and what does it mean to be in a community and be a part of a neighborhood. And so, the important part of being a neighbor and a theology of neighbor is to recognize that that all of us live in some kind of neighborhood. Pittsburgh is a city of neighborhoods, but also we're in global neighborhoods. We are in national conversation with each other, and the neighborhoods have sort of general requirements of each other, right? Whether that is the golden rule in a religious sense, or it's in a secular sense, just simply, hey, can you keep an eye out for the package on my doorstep, right? Or hey, what happens to my house can happen to your house, so we got to keep a lookout for each other. Those things matter, and being able to recognize that the demands on being a neighbor are not religious; they are communal, they are shared, and God creates and sustains us in and through our communities. And therefore, we're all kind of in the possibility of being neighbors one to another. And so as a seminary, we're working through how can we be a neighbor, a place that reforms, forms, and sustains this idea of neighbor, both in a religious context, but more specifically in a communal context, one with another. And being a good neighbor as an institution has a whole nother kind of dynamic to them.
Wow. A little bit more about leadership. Part of your job is fundraising. I've been in fundraising for 13 years. Fun. Best fundraising tips. What have you learned about it?
Be relational. Be yourself. Be relational. The ask is not as important as the relationship. That last one kind of feels counterintuitive, but a good relationship means you'll get to the ask. But if you don't, if you don't have a relationship with someone, you'll never get the ask. Additionally, being able to tell your story to multiple audiences is always an important part of fundraising, and that is you're never just talking to the person who's sitting in front of you. You're talking to all the various audiences they represent as well.
Wow.
Because if you have a good relationship with someone, you also have the potential for them to be their best relational person to someone else, and to introduce you to the next person that can breed that. So I value relationships more than anything else. I have a fundraising person who's dynamic. He's really great. He's always looking for me to tell him what to do, and my response to that is, you tell me who to talk to, right? This is because everybody wants a relationship with the president. If they don't want a relationship with the president, they may want a relationship with the institution. We are fortunate to be a well-endowed institution, which means it has a different problem, which is my job in fundraising means, why do you need the money? You got money. What do you need more money for, right? So, the relational piece is becoming an important part of, you want to be a part of what we're doing here, not just giving, but you want to be a part of our experience of being a part of PTS. So those are some of the quick tips that I'd give.
Love it. So I read that you have a proven track record for advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion in a seminary setting. Obviously, this is becoming more and more important to leaders everywhere, as it should be. What advice do you have for others when it comes to advancing this as well?
So I've had lots of great experiences doing diversity equity work. One of my best experiences was working with the Arlington County Fire Department in Arlington, Virginia. During COVID, I was just a citizen of Arlington County, and they got wind of my work at the seminary at the time, and in sort of communities around this issue. And the fire chief sought me out, and we were able to train 300 plus firefighters.
Wow.
On diversity equity work. In a non-threatening way. And you don't think, firefighters don't need this kind of stuff. They depend on each other, but actually they did. And some of the most diverse experiences I've ever had happened with those firefighters. But for me, we miss something when we do this diversity work without bringing in the theological aspect. And so my approach is often to say the diversity work that we say we're called to is not just because of legal requirements or because it's the thing of the day or it's something we ought to do. This is about human dignity, right? This is about being created in the image of God, and therefore all of us have a little bit of God's light in us. And so what that means is respecting each other and seeing each other not as monolithic, but as a diversity, that God is represented in all of these different people, right? And so then how do we build diversity as a question of human dignity and appreciating the experiences of each other, what those things are? You can't get that from a legal perspective. You can't get that from a sort of a philosophical ideology, but you've got to get that as a part of, you've got to live with these people in your community or on your job or in these places. And so being able to understand what makes them tick makes you a better person, and vice versa. And it makes the organization function better. And so those are the kinds of things. And it was most acute with these firefighters when you ask them non-threatening questions. And we only asked them 3 questions. Tell us something about your upbringing. Where'd you come from? Why are you a firefighter? And what's your experience of race? Only one of those 3 questions was a experience of race question, right? But the kinds of stories that were being talked about were personal stories about who they are.
Wow.
And you got to choose how you answer that question. But in answering that question, your fellow firefighters understood what made you tick.
Wow.
And in so doing, points of conversation, points of disagreement were illuminated in ways that help people to understand who they are. So those are the kinds of things that I did in the classroom. It's kind of things I did in the seminary environment. It's kind of things we're doing here at Pittsburgh Seminary. And I just think a lot of those legal trainings that we have to go through, or the diversity trainings that we experience, loses sight of those kinds of nuances and simplistic engagement around simply being human with each other.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think I heard Fred Rogers say, I quote this all the time, I hope I don't mess it up. It's like, there isn't a person you couldn't learn to love if you just heard their story. And I just love that those 3 questions, I mean, that's basically all it is. It's just people sharing stories. And that's beautiful. I haven't heard those 3 questions. So thank you for sharing that. With the few minutes we have left, I want to dive into the lightning round, a bunch of fun questions I ask in every interview. And the first one is, what is the best advice you've ever received and who gave it to you?
Again, I think I said it earlier. Great bit of advice he was the board chair of my seminary at the time. Now he's a bishop in Florida. Was be careful who you choose to be on your team, because the most important thing you do as a leader is choose who's on your team.
Come on. If you could put a quote on a billboard for everyone to read, what would it say?
Think.
That's one of the best answers I've heard. Beautiful. Maybe we can raise a little bit of money and put that up in Pittsburgh.
Just think.
What's a book that you've read either in the last year or all time that's significantly impacted you that you recommend most often?
Brene Brown's Dare to Lead was a really great text. Came out a couple years ago. I read it as a part of a class I was teaching on courageous leadership, and really thoughtful set of values plus strategies plus stories that kind of welded together sort of my core commitment of being what a leader is.
Outside of your growing Lego collection, what's something that people may not know about your journey that they should know?
I was a gigging musician. I was a piano player. Thursday nights I was a piano bar. Friday was nightclub. Saturday was bar mitzvahs, and Sunday was church. So I was.
Come on.
I was the real deal.
Do you have a favorite failure that led to a success or a valuable lesson?
I remember seeking this job at a community college to be a faculty member there. I was like, if I make it here, I am set. I am done. I was a shoe-in for the job. The chair of the department, I was their favorite candidate. I was lined up to be the person, and the provost swooped in and nixed the job and gave it to somebody else. And that failure of them to choose me was the best thing that could ever happen, because that got me going back to school, finish my doctorate, and then got me back into the seminary education and kind of accelerated the next steps. Had I been hired in that job, my life would be very different right now.
Wow. It's funny how things work out. You
Yep.
get to spend time with a lot of leaders, and I'm just curious, when you get to spend time with someone that you look up to and admire, do you have a go-to question that you always ask?
My usual question is, because I'm around faith leaders a lot of times. So my usual question is, what does the gospel of Jesus Christ mean to you?
Can you answer that for us?
For me, the gospel of Jesus Christ is life. It is liberative, and it is the ever imaginative and creative story of how God liberates us from our own limited imagination, not just from sin, but also our own limited ways of thinking about this world.
You got that down, man. You were ready. Biggest leadership pet peeve?
The failure to make decisions. This could be a podcast all of itself. Everybody that I hire, I say the single most important thing that a leader does, strip it all down, you make decisions. Even a bus driver who's the leader of a bus is going to go left or right or straight or back. You've got to make decisions, and leaders that don't make decisions, I have no space for.
I don't know if you have an actual bucket list or not, but what's something you've done in your life that you think everyone should do before they die?
I think you should see the sunset on the Atlantic Ocean.
Love it.
It gives you a different perspective.
If you could go back and have coffee with yourself at any age and you would have actually listened, what age would that be, and what would you tell that version of Asa?
I think I'd probably be a freshman in high school. I think I was most open at that time, and I would say to him, think more broadly and try out more things. Much of my life was sort of, I made my mind up, I'm going to do this one thing, and looking back, if I had more options for them, if I'd taken more options, I may have chosen something different or not. But that's one thing that I think about often.
And on the other end of your life, looking back at the end, what do you want to be remembered for, and what do you want your legacy to be?
More than anything else, I'd love to be someone that was remembered to have integrity in the decisions that they made, that left the place better than how they found it, and that was able to provide for his family in a way that was long-term sustainability for them.
Anything else you want to leave leaders with today, or anything else you want to talk about?
No, this is great. Thanks for having me, Doug.
Yeah, Asa, this has been great. Thanks again. And thanks for moving to Pittsburgh. We are blessed to have you here. Our city is better because of you. And it's been an honor to get to know you a little bit, even though I guess I'll never actually get to be one of your friends because you don't need any more. I'm just joking.
Fair enough.
Yeah, thanks for your time today. Looking forward to doing it again sometime.
Thanks, Doug.
Yep. Well, leader, thank you so much for listening to my conversation with Dr. Asa Lee. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did. You can find ways to connect with him and links to everything that we discussed in the show notes at l3leadership.org/396. And as always, leader, I want to challenge you that if you want to 10x your growth this next year, then you need to either launch or join an L3 Leadership Mastermind Group. Mastermind groups are simply groups of 6 to 12 leaders that meet together on a consistent basis for at least 1 year in order to help each other grow, hold each other accountable, and to do life together. For me personally, mastermind groups have been the greatest source of growth in my life over the last 8 years, which is why I believe everyone should be in one. And if you're interested in learning more about launching or joining a group, go to l3leadership.org/masterminds or email me at dougsmith@l3leadership.org. And as always, I like to end every episode with a quote, and I will quote Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and he said this. He said, "Success isn't always about greatness. It's about consistency." And I love that. Well, leader, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Know that my wife, Laura, and I love you. We believe in you, and I say it every episode, but don't quit. Keep leading. The world desperately needs your leadership. We'll talk to you next episode.